Okay, the story of my first bet. I came from a family of horse players. My father, my uncles, my grandfather all bet the horses, and my grandfather got me a job at Arlington Park in 1968 as a busboy. And I would go to the track every day and work like crazy. And at night, my father, who loved the horses, every chance he got, would come out there and watch the races and drive me home after the last race. And on the way home, he would give me the racing form and tell me, "Here, I'm going to teach you how to read the racing form." So he would say, "See that AP? That stands for Arlington Park. And the T with a circle is the turf outer course, but the T with a square, inside the square, it was inner turf," and so on, because racing form has a lot of information in it, and you have to know how to read it. So that's what I did. On the weekends, he would give me a racing form from a previous month, and he would hide the results. He would say, "Okay, here's a race I want you to handicap. It's a Belmont, it's a mile and an eighth, and I want you to study it. I want you to check the quarter times of each horse, the half times, the three-quarter, the mile, and you have to calculate each horse's time at each race, and you have to predict where they're going to be in this race." And we also even created like speed numbers. So when you looked at those horses' numbers from the past, you'd have to look at all the other races that day to see if his numbers were substantially better or worse than horses similar to him, or better or worse. It was a fairly complicated mathematical problem that you had to solve there. Then you had to come up with a pace scenario, and you had to have the final order of finish of the race. So I did that for a year, maybe 2 years. In 1970, one day he came to me in the morning and he said, "Here's today's racing form. You're going to handicap it, and we're going to bet your pick." And he said, so he went off to work, and I started doing my study. And the study had to be at least 2 hours, probably more like 3 hours a day for one race, if you can believe that. But that was standard for that day. So I studied the race. It seemed to be a somewhat paceless race, very little speed, but one horse really stood out as the fastest horse. So I remember his name was Datsun, something like that. And then I can't remember the second horse, but there was another horse who had good tactical speed, but wasn't as fast as Datsun. And after hours of study, I came to the conclusion that this was mile race out of the chute, that Datsun and this other horse were on the outside, which is the best position to be in, and that they would go off and run away with the race. So 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my father came home early and said, "We're going out to the track. Hop in the car and tell me your selection." So I told him. He says, "Look at it again. Look at the form again. Read it while we're in the car and make sure you're absolutely right." So I did that. Of course, nothing changed. I had studied it for 3 hours. He wasn't maybe sure of that, but we went to the track, and when we got to the track, he told me, he says, "Give me $1." So I gave him $1. I said, "What are you going to bet?" He said, "We're going to bet an exacta. Datsun and your second horse, in that order, $2 exacta." And I said, "Okay, that's great." So he went and made the bet. And when the race went off, it went off pretty much exactly as I expected. Datsun took the early lead. The other horse was maybe 2 lengths behind. Coming around the turn, Datsun started pulling ahead. He was maybe 4 or 5 lengths ahead of the second horse, and the second horse was 6 or 7 lengths ahead of the third horse. And they just trotted down the stretch to the wire in that order, no problem. And so my father went and collected the money, and he came back with $145. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Maybe we should invest this in the next race." And very shortly after that, he said, No. You didn't study the next race. Only bet races that you really studied." And that was the start of our really good relationship with the horses. My father and I talked about the horses every day, and until the end of his life in 1993. And it was only years later that I realized that my father was really not confident in a 15 or 16-year-old kid. So he asked me for $1, thinking, well, this bet was definitely going to be a loss. He didn't want to lose more than $1 on my selections at that time, and but beginner's luck and hard work paid off, and that was the story of my first bet.